So, to contrast the two of them, Kant, in his discussion of practical necessity, clearly thinks that there's, or at least to me, clearly thinks that there's a way to answer the questions about rules themselves, about which rules to adopt. And then you go over to the other side, we take Carnap and his linguistic frameworks and empiricism, semantics, and ontology, and he says, just the pragmatic question, he doesn't go into much detail, but he's just, whatever one you want to use, whatever is useful, something like that. Where does Sellars here in language, rules, and behavior lie on a spectrum between those two sorts of responses?
Well, good question, and I think he does situate himself explicitly there. If you look at the very end of the essay, let's see. What he says is, look, in talking about the whole sort of the way the whole language hangs together, and there not being sort of point-by-point justification or grounding of your version of the real connections, because you're not seeing them as reflecting a distinctive kind of fact. Haven't you really given everything away to the pragmatist? And at that point, he's thinking of the Carnapian pragmatism about the rules of the language, the choice of the language. And I said, aren't you surrendering and saying, well, Dewey was right, and Carnap has said he's right, come over to that side. And Sellars says, well, I am with them in their description of theory choice. Where we differ strongly is that the pragmatist thinks that he's doing philosophy when he says that. And Sellars insists that that's not. That the practical choice of linguistic frameworks is not a philosophical question. That it doesn't belong to the task of producing and deploying the conceptual resources to talk about the rules of any possible empirical language, so pure pragmatics in that sense. It's no part of that to say what the considerations are that would make one set of rules more practically useful than another, or what the considerations should be to talk one way rather than another. That's not a philosophical question. That's, in some sense, an empirical question. That's the sense in which the empiricists and the pragmatists are together. You're going to try some things and see how they work out. That's an empirical process. That's the Deweyan version of empiricism. And that's not philosophy, he wants to say. So he says, I haven't sort of admitted that the pragmatists are right. Now, what was Carnap's view about that? I'd say Sellars is being a pretty orthodox Carnapian in saying that. Carnap, qua philosopher, doesn't pretend to tell us which language we should speak. He's giving us the tools for writing down the rules of any possible empirical language. That's what the philosopher does. And it's only the pragmatist who thinks that it's the pragmatist philosopher's job to help you out in doing that. Okay. Now, language rules and behavior is incredibly suggestive. We get in there all these Wittgensteinian claims. The meaning of an expression is entirely determined by the rules for its use. This is said more than once in the essay. The only person I can find before Wittgenstein talking about meaning in terms of use this way is, of all people, Isaac Newton. In Principia, he doesn't assert that meaning is use. It's the antecedent of a conditional. He says, if meaning is use, then has a consequence, and immediately draws the consequence. So he's implicitly endorsing the antecedent. But he's saying it as if this were a common phrase that was bandied about, and that people always said that, and he's going along. He says, if meaning is use, then, this is true because this is the way the word is actually used. But I haven't been able to find anybody else sort of around then who says that, and in between. It wasn't the sort of thing people said. And given how casually Newton brings it in, I'm not tempted to call this the Newtonian doctrine or something like that. That would be overblown. But when Sellars is saying this is by no means a well-known slogan or something people understand. Sellars says everything in the language has the content or the meaning that it does because of the conformation rules, his name added to the formation and transformation rules. That is the inferential moves, what he'll call language moves in some reflections on language games. Here we're seeing the first of his semantic inferentialism, that conceptual content is inferential role. Next time we're reading Inference and Meaning, which is the canonical locus classicus for that semantic inferentialism. But he's a functionalist about conceptual content here. There weren't functionalists in those days. There wouldn't be until the late 60s. He's saying, no, you've got to look at the role that these things play in a language where that's a normative functionalism now, because it's the role with respect to the rules. What do the rules say are the moves you can make? Here, the language moves, language entrance moves, language exit moves, as we'll see, and as he says later on in the essay. Normative functionalism, maybe not till the 80s are people talking this way. That is, first they were computational functionalists, and then they were causal functionalists, thinking about the role in a set of causal relations. People like Jerry Fodor never got beyond that sort of causal / dispositional functionalism. And for Sellars, is not functionalism between anybody's ears. It's functionalism in the role played in a linguistic community, the one whose rules these things are. So it's a kind of social functionalism, normative functionalism. This, again, I think that's what I think Wittgenstein thinks. He's not interested in conceptual content. Wittgenstein isn't. He's interested in, whatever roles expressions can play in discursive practices. But there's social practices and they're implicitly normative practices. And we're to look at the significance things have, the pragmatic significance they have, is the role in these implicitly normative social practices. Well, that's where Sellars is in 1949 as well. He and Wittgenstein are the two people who are thinking this way. But Sellars has systematic philosophical aspirations in a way that Wittgenstein didn't. Wittgenstein thought that though he and Sellars agree that philosophy is not one of the natural sciences, we don't want to be descriptivists, naturalists, we don't want to endorse psychologism. They agree on that. But Wittgenstein thinks that if you give theories if you give systematic accounts of things, and in particular, if you postulate unobservables, theoretical entities, then you're doing science. And if and because philosophy isn't one of the natural sciences, it can't be appropriate for philosophers to systematically theorize about anything. What they can do is pointed reminders, describe what's on the surface, remind us that things aren't always the way the generalizations that we've inherited from dead philosophers lead us to expect that they are. And Sellars has a different way of distinguishing empirical theories from philosophical theories, and thinks philosophical theorizing is just okay. And his genius Jones in the second half of EPM is precisely going to be postulating unobservable entities as part of his philosophical behaviorism as opposed to logical behaviorism. Logical behaviorism understands psychological concepts as having to be explicitly definable in terms of the specifications of behavior, observable behavior. Sellars thinks that's a kind of instrumentalism, and philosophical behaviorism says, look, the point of talking mental talk is to explain behavior, codify at least proprieties of behavior, talk about the norm governedness of behavior, but it's okay to postulate unobservable entities as things that are not reducible to or definable in terms of behavior in order to make sense of the behavior. So Sellars' response to being a normative social functionalist about linguistic expressions and being an inferentialist is to say, well, let's then, as philosophers, come up with a vocabulary for talking about these things. Let's craft a pragmatic meta-vocabulary for discussing the conferral of content on expressions by their playing roles in a rule-governed structure of practices, a structure of practices that's, we'll see, has to be thought of as implicitly normative, where rules are making explicit the norms that are implicit in the practices. So he's aiming to give a philosophical theory of these things. I think it's Wittgensteinian, modulo the fact that there clearly is no inferentialism in Wittgenstein. And he's not, in that sense, concerned with the notion of conceptual content. He's a semantic nihilist. This Dummett's expression, where the sort of picture of a semantic theory is we're going to associate a notion of content with expressions, and then there's going to be a systematic way to derive proprieties of the governing the use of expressions from the content of the expression and what speech act is performed and some out of a relatively small finite number of possible speech acts, and depending on the context, where we can specify in a fairly abbreviated form the relevant features of the context. So the idea of content is going to be, this is the way Dummett's thinking about it, is going to be, well, you associate one thing with an expression, its content, and then you have a general theory that says, well, and so if this is uttered to perform this kind of speech act with this pragmatic force, and in this context where we've got a botanization of the speech acts and we've got a botanization of the relevant features of the context, there's going to be a uniform way of deriving the norms that govern the use of that expression to perform that speech act in that context. And Wittgenstein says, language is a motley. There is no finite set of speech acts you can perform. Any list you could have, I can always add ones to. There is no limitation on what features of the context could be relevant, and there's no core notion of meaning or content associated with expressions that could systematically be used to derive or compute the proprieties governing the use. So he's somewhere between skeptical and nihilistic about that semantic enterprise. Now, I think Wittgenstein wishes that's who he was. That's what he thinks you should do. That's what he thinks you should think. And he just can't help introducing concepts like criteria and family resemblance. And he does introduce a conceptual apparatus, even though officially he's not supposed to do that. This is a kind of pathology that seriously anti-theoretical philosophers like John McDowell fall into. They sort of can't help themselves from expressing theoretical insights, even though they try not to. But I do think this ideology is sort of in play in Wittgenstein. He does not think, as I do, that, and as Sellars does, that language has a downtown. That's his image. He says language doesn't have a downtown, it's sort of all suburbs. Sellars thinks that practices of giving and asking for reasons are downtown. You have to have those inferential language moves for it to be a discursive practice, for it to be a practice in which you can say that things are thus and so, for it to be a practice in which you can describe things. This is all argument from inference and meaning, and we'll see later on. There's not a trace of this in Wittgenstein. So, if one's going to use, as I'm urging, Sellars as a guide to Wittgenstein, you've got to divide through by this semantic inferentialism. Now, I think Sellars gets a lot of mileage out of that semantic inferentialism, but it's not all that's going on. So, the bare bones of a meta-language, a set of concepts for thinking about the use of language that he starts with, and this is already more than Wittgenstein will give us, is this division between three kinds of moves in a language game. Modeled on game because of the relation to rules specifically, and of course they have this in common. Sellars is maybe more aware minute by minute of the difference between rules, which you can say, and norms, which are what are made explicit in the form of rules but are not to be confused with them. Wittgenstein uses rule where Sellars would use norm, as well as where Sellars would use rule. In Wittgenstein's mouth, in his pen, when he talks about rules, it doesn't mean that there's an explicit statable. You can't always state the rule when there's a rule. Whereas for Sellars, a rule is something you can say. It's putting in the form of a principle a norm that can be implicit in practice. But the very beginning of his meta-vocabulary is saying there's three kinds of moves. There's language entry moves, where you're responding to something that is not a position in the language game by taking up a position in the language game. And there's language moves, where you're moving from one position in the language game. You've played the counter, the coin is copper, and then you use that to justify the move to playing the counter. The coin will melt at 1084 degrees C. And then there's language exit transitions. Language entry transitions, when I look at something and say the light is red, the light being red is not a position in this game. It's not subject to rules of the kind that govern the game, but I can respond to it by taking up a stance, by claiming that it's red. Say, the light's red. And that's a language entry transition. And I can respond to my claim that's cruel by doing something, by grabbing the stick from the guy who's beating the horse, and make a difference in the world, which is not itself a position in the game, but I responded to something that was a position in the game, claiming that that was cruel, by acting in a certain way. And so it's just what we got to think about these different kinds of moves. And one of the questions is, well, so the language moves are rule governed. There are going to be statable inferential principles. What we're doing when we engage in philosophy in the Socratic mode is precisely making explicit those inferential rules, the ones that determine the propriety of making moves. Can you justify the claim that it's pious by the claim that it's loved by the gods? Or does justification run in the other direction? The philosophical explicative task of the philosopher is to deploy and sharpen the tools that we use to make these things explicit, these language moves explicit. He asks himself the question, already back in language rules and behavior, what about these language entry transitions? He's not calling them that yet, but he's saying there's tied behavior. I've learned to respond to red things by being disposed to call them red, to take up that normative stance, undertake that commitment to things being red in response to things in the environment. And in language rules and behavior, he says, those entries are not themselves rule governed. Those are merely causal connections. They're what, in articulating his view, I've called reliable differential responsive dispositions, RDRDs, where the kid has learned, as a pigeon could learn, to respond to the visible presence of red things, make it the parrot, by saying, rock, that's red. But he's not following a rule when he says that. And when the kid learns to call the lollipop red, if he gets the color right, he gets the lollipop. He's not following a rule when he does that. He's just learning how to reliably respond differentially to the presence of red things by making one kind of noise rather than another. In LRB, he's explicit. This is causally tied behavior. It's what matter-of-factual psychologists can study, is those RDRDs. That's what operant conditioning produces, is RDRDs. And he's saying, in LRB, that's why those, what he'll come to call observation reports, non-inferential reports, those tokenings are playing a dual role. They're causally elicited by environing stimuli, and they are the taking up of a position in this rule-governed game, a position which crucially is then available to make language moves That is, to provide premises or reasons from which you can draw conclusions which you can use to justify other positions. The core of his critique of what he'll call the myth of the given is that for those language entry moves to be conceptually contentful, it's not enough that they be upstream, elicited by environing stimuli. They have to downstream also be able to serve as premises for reasoning. And similarly, for language exit transitions, he doesn't address those here. He does at the end of some reflections. He's thinking of these as entries and exits to the norm-governed practices of giving and asking for reasons. They're entries to that language system, which is what, in the view of LRB, that's what's rule-governed. And at the edges, it causally impinges on things. Now, that view, the view of LRB, is the one that I attribute to him even in EPM, and say he has what I call a two-ply picture of observation, where one of them is, well, you need to be applying a concept. So the concept is a matter of playing a role in the language moves, its inferential role. But what's special about observational concepts, or better, observational uses of concepts, is that for them, it can also be appropriate to undertake that commitment in direct response to some environing stimulus. But that's all that's required, is that your mastery of the inferential role of this thing be connected to an RDRD. If you've got those two things, you've got an observation statement. And I take it to be a strength of this view that you can understand how normative terms could have observational uses. You need to understand the inferential role of the normative terms. Well, he started to gesture at that. Those are expressions whose proper understanding tends to make them true. Let's remember that. But he's going to have more things to say about what that inferential role is. And you have to hook them up to an RDRD. Now, for instance, McDowell thinks it's very important that we can hear meanings, and meanings are normative roles. So it's very important to him that normative terms have observational uses. And he takes it that someone who has been properly brought up, part of mastering the use of a term like cruel is that you can respond non-inferentially to paradigmatic, visible occurrences of cruel behavior by calling them cruel non-inferentially, not going through an inferential process. Oh, that's causing pain, and there's no good reason to cause the pain, so that satisfies the sufficient conditions for cruelty. No, if you're properly brought up and have mastered a thick evaluative term like cruelty, then when you see that guy beating the horse to death, you don't have to reason about it. You don't have to go through an inferential process. You can see that that's cruel. That is, you've acquired this reliable differential responsive disposition to respond to things like that by applying the term cruel to them in the same way you have for red. I mean, you've got to have more sort of surround inferentially for cruelty than you do for red, but there's no reason it can't have an observational role in the same sense that red does. And that means that cruelty is visible in the same sense that redness is. Now that's a radical view. I push that again and say, and that means that if we put this together with the Quinean doctrine, that what's an observation or term for one person may not be for another. The archaeologist may be able to tell the difference between Aztec and Toltec pock shards by looking at them. She can do it, I can't. I don't have the RDRDs for them. I don't even really have the concepts, Aztec and Toltec, a firm grip on the inferential distinctions between them. And the physicist on this account, who's looking in the bubble chamber, can come literally to be able to see mu mesons, even though mu mesons are moving at almost the speed of light and are really small. He's not seeing a hooked track in the bubble chamber and inferring that there's a mu meson. That hooked track is just part of the causal chain of reliably co-varying events that starts with the mu meson and ends with him applying the concept not hooked vapor trail, but mu meson. And that's, on this account, all there is to directly seeing a mu meson. Now, this is an extremely radical way of thinking about observation. It's the view that Sellars endorses in LRB. McDowell insists this is not Sellars' mature view. And furthermore, it's a terrible thing to mean by observation. He says it's not a concept of observation. When he talks about it, he calls it bobservation. That's my notion of observation, and draws a severe distinction here, because it's an essential doctrine of mind and world that to make intelligible the contents of our empirical concepts, and so much as the possibility of empirical knowledge, we have to say that the visible presence of the red thing is not just causing my judgment that it's red. It's providing the reason that justifies my calling it red. The connection can't just be causal. It can't just be an RDRD. It has to be a rule-governed, reason-giving relation. That's not to say it has to be inferential. The way in which the visible presence of the red thing gives me a reason to make the judgment is not an inferential one. It's a sui generis observational one. But within the division, is this a matter of a norm-governed, rule-governed reason relation, or is it a matter of causal interaction? McDowell says it's got to be a reason. Observation is going with Davidson, who says only a belief can be a reason for another belief. Some way the world is can't be a reason for a belief. Only another belief can be. And that's what the Sellars of LRB thinks. Now that's not the view in some reflections on language games. He has a much more sophisticated view there, and I think I was too enamored of this other view. That's my story and I'm sticking to it, but it's not Sellars' view in some reflections, and so I think not in EPM. It's not John's view either. It's a different one. But I think the sort of punchline of some reflections is this more sophisticated view. So all of this has been propedeutic to the problematic that he sets out at the beginning of the essay, which is, okay, we say that this use of language, that the use of language is rule governed, because we're not going to be psychologistic, we're not going to be descriptivists about it. One way we could go wrong would be to be descriptivists and just see regularities, no norms, nothing that's properly codified in the form of a rule. That's Scylla. We don't want to run afoul of that. But on the other hand, the full-blown notion of rule governedness requires you're consulting the rule and using that to guide what you're doing. Kant says the difference between the way rules of laws of nature, rules in the form of laws of nature, are binding on merely natural creatures, and the way rational rules are binding on rational creatures, is that we're bound by our conceptions of rules. We formulate the rule and consult it. But, as Kant already saw, though for some reason he relegates this to a footnote, there's a danger of a regress here if you think that concept use is essentially rule governed. Then in order to consult the rule, you have to apply the concept in it, and that means applying the rules in it, and there's at least a chicken and egg problem here. There's the danger of an infinite regress. It can't be that when the child is learning to use the term red, she's consulting a rule, call red things red. Because to use that rule, you've got to already have the concept red as a contentful, I'm so sorry. To have that, you have to have that concept. In another place later on, Sellars fantasizes about the infant mind. I don't even know how to turn this thing off. Fantasizes about the infant mind on this picture. It's the same picture that Wittgenstein, oh, for heaven's sakes, that Wittgenstein talks about as the Augustinian picture in the opening of the Investigations. Sellars says, and the infant mind is there saying, oh, there's one. Yes, that one's similar. There it goes again. Ah, by the inductive methods of John Stuart Mill, that must be what mother means by red. I said, no, this can't be. The way Sellars reads, Sellars' version of the Kantian notion, we're bound by conceptions of rules, is to say full-blooded rule governedness requires the causal efficacy of some explicit representation of the rule. So I'm rule governed in the most, in the full-blooded sense, when I can actually consult a representation of the rule to decide what it is I should do next. So I recite to myself, I before E except after C. Okay, and then I can write this down. And it says, that can't be the way we sort of come into the language. There'd be a regress of that. So that view, that's the view I call regulism, that all the normativity is rules, explicit rules. And the trouble is, you can't understand or apply a rule unless you can use concepts. And we're talking about the normative articulation of concepts. And the conclusion is there has to be a form of normativity that's implicit in what you do, in addition to the form of normativity that's explicit, sayable in rules or principles. And I think Wittgenstein makes exactly this argument, that a way to go wrong is to be a descriptivist, a dispositionalist. If the norms go missing, all you have is regularities. That's wrong. That won't make sense of thinking or saying something. But the other way is to think, no, there must be an explicit rule that you can consult, a representation and expression of the rule that you can consult. No, that can't be right either. There has to be something that is acknowledging the norm in practice, in the way you go on. So even if you can't say what the rule is for the signpost, there has to be following the signpost or going against it in what you do, quite apart from what you're able to say. But now, Sellars makes two moves in this vicinity that we don't get in Wittgenstein. One of them is, he says, there's another way in which a rule can be relevant to what's actually done. And this is what he'll come to call pattern governed. It can be that one acts in this way, the pattern comes about because there was a regularity before, a regularity formulated in a rule, but it's the regularity that happened according to the rule that is causally efficacious in bringing about the pattern. And this is, he uses the example of the bee dance, which was brand new at this point. It just come out, that they had that the ethologists had figured out this, how to decode the bee dances. And the thing is there, the pattern is there because the pattern had been there before, and that had an adaptive value. And even though the bees are not formulating this rule, the regularity that is formulable as a rule explains the continuation of the regularity. Now, this is the clue that Sellars' star student, really his only PhD student at Yale, Ruth Millikan, thought about for 25 years and managed to make an academic career, but nobody had ever heard of her. She didn't write anything for 25 years. And then she wrote this book, Language, Thought, and Other Biological Categories, that blew everybody's mind. And it was following out this idea of pattern-governed behavior as a naturalistic form of normativity from which you could elaborate, she claims, discursive normativity in general. And my own view is there's so far really only two straws floating. There's that Millikan notion, and there's a social notion of normativity of the kind that making it explicit is an instance of. You either go with her sort of selectional account or with a social account. I mean, there could be other ones, but those are the ones that have been sort of worked out now. And it's just this passage from this one essay that she just agonized about for all those years and really got to work. Whether that's the right kind of normativity for the language or not, but it could be. But the solution that Sellars really gives goes by so fast that people often miss it. That's an application of this. And he says, look, it's true that the kid who is learning can't consult a representation of the rule, call red things red. But that's not the only way that a representation of the rule could be causally efficacious in bringing about the regularity. The teacher rehearses to herself, what am I trying to get the kid to do? I'm trying to get them to call red things red. The teacher has mastered the use of red and can understand this rule and uses it to decide, did the child do the right thing or not? Well, was he calling red things red? Was that red? Consulting this representation of the rule in order to train the RDRDs, to get the right RDRDs in the kid. That's essentially social, and he's doing exactly what Wittgenstein said we should do to demystify some feature of practice. Look at how it's taught. And if there's nothing mysterious about people learning to talk this way, then don't puzzle yourself about what in the world is represented here. If you can understand how kids can learn to count, and based on that, how they can learn to add and subtract, so you can understand their use of numerals, then don't ask what it is in the world that's represented by these things. Maybe that's not the grammar of the terms, but there's nothing hidden in numeral use if you can understand how we can catch on to the norms of using it properly. And there isn't anything mysterious about seeing how people can master language entry transitions either. As long as we think of language as an up and running enterprise, the ones who have the concepts can be guided by these formulations of rules. And in that sense, even the behavior of the child is genuinely rule governed. It just can't happen between the ears of one individual. You have to go social and diachronic in order to understand it. That's what I think Sellars' view is about the entry and exit transitions. They're not mere RDs. They are rule governed, but in this distinctive sense, in this distinctive way. Now, that's not John's view either. I think sort of both of us, even though we sort of knew this about some reflections, didn't really see our way to apply that to this question. I mean, I should say, John seriously objects to the terminology, language entry and language exit transitions, because he thinks the only way you can see the things in the world, the visible presence of red things, as providing reasons, is to treat the conceptual as unbounded and the visible presence of red things as already conceptually articulated. So where Sellars thinks language entry transitions are the point of contact between the non-conceptual, causally articulated world and the conceptually articulated space of reasons, John thinks there isn't anything outside the space of reasons. That to think of entries into the space of reasons is already to excavate a gulf between mind and world. Now, I said later I would try and say something crisp about my Hegel on the relation between normativity and modality. I'm going to do that in 2 minutes. And that is this. I think John will not say what he means by concepts. And so sort of what it is unbounded, well, he doesn't believe that's a necessary part of saying all of this, as he won't explain sort of how does it work that we can observe normative things. I think Hegel has a non-psychological conception of the conceptual, that to be conceptually articulated is to stand in relations of consequence and incompatibility, his mediation and determinate negation, and that those come in two flavors. They can be alethic modal necessities. It follows from something being copper that it conducts electricity, and it's incompatible with its being solid at 2,000 degrees. Or they can be deontic normative. The commitment to its being copper is incompatible with a commitment to its being an electrical insulator. It's not impossible for you to have both commitments, it's just inappropriate. It's wrong. You're obliged to change something if you have that. If you're committed to its being copper, you're committed, whether you know it or not, to its being an electrical conductor, that it's not impossible for you to fail to draw that, but you ought to draw that. I think Hegel thinks the conceptual is unbounded because to say they're laws of nature is to say that there are these necessities and incompatibilities in the world, alethic modal ones, and that they're mirrored in a way in the normative relations in us, and that when all goes well, the very same conceptual content that is copper, that substance conceptually articulated by the laws determining its consequences and incompatibility, is mirrored by my conception of copper, what I take myself to be committed to and precluded from being committed to here. I think he's a bimodal, hylomorphic conceptual realist. He thinks these conceptual contents come in two modal forms, an alethic modal form and a deontic modal form, one of them on the side of being and the other on the side of thought, and that, to pick one of John's favorite quotes, when I say and mean that things are thus and so, my thought and my meaning don't stop anywhere short of the fact that things are thus and so. This is Wittgenstein, this is what McDowell would say. That's the Hegelian story about how that can be the case. The content has one form in the world articulated by these modal relations of incompatibility and consequence, and another form in my thought articulated by these normative relations of. Now, this is not John's view. This is not what he means by the unboundedness of the conceptual, but that is a reading. That's different from the Sellarsian one because he has non-conceptual stuff, very causal stuff. The norms only apply to us, and there isn't an analog of that. But he has a different way of understanding the relation between norms and modalities. A transposed language of norms is what he says about modals. And you'll see some more of that later on. So a good thing to do would be to read over these passages that I've excerpted now that you have sort of these stories about it, and move on to the inferentialism next time. But as opposed to the things we read before this week, starting with some reflections on language games, Sellars never changes his mind about these fundamental things. This remains part of his view. This is the first real expression of the Sellarsian view.